Hello, everyone. Welcome to Reading the Room, a literary podcast featuring author interviews and discussions with bookish content creators. My name is Jalen, also known as The Bar and the Bookcase on YouTube. Today, I am joined by Amina Kane, author of A Horse at Night, published by Dorothy Project. Amina, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
This book spoke to me incredibly deeply. I was just absolutely floored by every page and on the sentence, which is something that you talk about as well in this book. But I hadn't thought in recent memory of another book that I connected to in this way because of late I've been thinking a lot about what fiction is and what novels are and why I'm so into them of late and what that means and how to think about them more critically. And so this book really helped me think about many questions that I have about fiction. And I think you and I think very similarly about fiction, which is really cool to read. So can you give us a synopsis?
A Horse at Night, I think, is just my thinking space. I say at a certain point in the book that I often write to see what's inside my mind, which is kind of a funny statement because you think, you should know what's inside your mind, and especially because our minds are always like running so rapidly. But it's really through writing that I discover what my preoccupations are sometimes, and sort of like preoccupate, not sort of like the monkey mind preoccupations, but sort of like my deeper preoccupations. And so I think probably any book I write is a thinking space, but Horse at Night is especially that, a thinking space about the acts of reading and writing and being in the world and looking at art, looking at nature, etc.
On the first page of this book, you mention how this is like a diary of sorts, but then you then question like, well, what is this actually? What is this piece of writing? And I loved how this collection of vignettes sort of just dabbles in a bunch of different topics that flows really well. So I wanted to ask you about how you kind of decided on the structure for this and how like the editing process was of getting all of your thoughts into one book.
I'll be honest and say that structure often feels difficult for me. I'm very much an intuitive writer, and so I'm not conceptual at all. Like I don't think about structure from the outset. Some writers do, and I really admire that. Don't really think of much at the outset. I start with some sort of things that are I can see, like, but just in a blurry way, or like a faraway voice, and kind of my whole task in writing the book is to get closer, to hear what I'm hearing, more clearly, and to see what I'm seeing more clearly. And so it's a very intuitive process. And I just kind of keep writing, and I see kind of what happens. And then when it's all done, I have to deal with it, like I have to think about structure if that's something that hasn't sort of naturally developed as I've been writing. And so I was writing, A Horse at Night started, I was writing these kind of separate pieces, but quickly realized that they were kind of part of the same cloth. I was returning to the same space in a way when I was working on them. And so I thought of them in a way as separate, and then in the process of writing them and editing them and kind of putting the book together, saw that they really were kind of the same voice, the same preoccupations. And I'm someone who edits sort of early on. I edit as I'm going, I kind of revise as I'm going. So there was a lot of that happening. But then also once I started working with Danielle and Marty at Dorothy, a publishing project, on revisions, they could really see too that the pieces were kind of all of one cloth, or like all of one voice. And so they were helpful in terms of just kind of cementing that. And then in terms of like how the pieces were going to work together and like what was going to go where, it was just more intuitive. I just kind of followed this like intuitive voice.
It really does all, tie together so incredibly well. And what I think is so interesting about this book too is like you talk about the craft of writing as you are a writer, but you're also considering what it means to read for you. So can you talk about that distinguishing factor, if any, between reading and writing for yourself?
Well, they're different, of course, but I need to read in order to write for sure. I mean, I think that's true for all writers, but it feels especially true for me. And at a certain point, I realized that I'm a writer because I've connected to certain books so much, and not that that means, I mean, you can be a reader and not a writer and still connect to a book deeply. It doesn't have to work out that way, but for me, it did. There are lots of books I love, but not every book sort of sends me into a writing space, but certain ones do. And so I think, in a way, my process of writing is a way of talking back to those books, or writing back to those books. That there's generally some kind of space that they open for me as a reader. Like space is open for all of us, when we read particular books, but the space that gets open for me then becomes, when I'm reading, then becomes a writing space.
That's so interesting because this book kind of deals with this interesting question of like, is there a distinguishing factor between life versus fiction? And like, what is that distinguishing factor? And there's one part in this book where you talk about attaching our lives to fiction. And there's a quote that I love that my life comes into my fiction too, and now I am writing of it here, attached to my reading and my writing, attached to darkness, solitude, the ocean, attached to fiction. And even beyond this, you, in the beginning of the book, you talk about setting and how setting sort of serves as a character in itself in fiction. And so I wanted to ask you about setting in your work and how you think about it in terms of character and landscape and those ideas that you present in this book.
So setting is something that's definitely important to me as a writer. Atmosphere and setting, it gets connected to me, to imagery, because I love to sort of, I think, describe a world, and not just describe it so that the reader can see it, but to find out what else is there. Like I think place is very interesting. I think settings and landscape are very interesting. It's, I think it's maybe like in the third section of the book, I write about, landscape and character as being connected. And of course that might not be true for every book, that's written, but often it's the way I read. And when I write, it's very hard for me to separate setting and atmosphere from narrative voice. For instance, character for me comes a lot through narrative voice and through how characters sound when they speak and how they talk to each other. And so it really all gets mixed in, for me as a writer. Like I can't separate sort of setting from atmosphere, from narrative voice, from character. They're all kind of working, together to create something, to create the book that I write or the story.
Yeah, I mean, I think a clear example of that is in Delicacy, which I read, I think, 2 years ago, I want to say, and I loved it. And I think you kind of talking about that is very indicative of that novel because it doesn't really tell you the time or place of the book, but the setting is still so like vital to how the book feels and how it just reads itself as well. And I thought that was really interesting, and I've never really read a book like that. It felt very singular in my mind of how you sort of play with ambiguity in that book in a really excellent way. So I wanted to ask you about ambiguity and like hiding things within your sentences, for example. That's an idea that's presented here that I thought was really a cool way of describing that. So can you just talk about like the act of hiding or what you choose to put into a book versus what you choose to leave out?
Yeah, it's so important. I mean, I write pretty short books. I write pretty spare books, and I am, in my writing process, what comes out is sort of minimalist. It is sort of minimal, but at the same time, there's a lot I write that I get rid of. So in Indelicacy, I wrote for a year and then got rid of everything except for one passage, which then sort of placed me into the book. And then later on, I read the manuscript over and I thought, I really hate it. I hate it now. And so the only way to not hate it was to get rid of half of it. And from there, I could like it again, and feel connected to it again. So I'm always kind of in this process of clearing out a text that I'm writing, like even as I'm creating it, like even as I'm generating the story. For me, in writing fiction and writing nonfiction too, you're always kind of negotiating what will appear, in the book and what won't, because you have so many thoughts and you write so many things, but like what things will remain and how will they speak to each other, which feels exciting. For me, it points to the possibilities in fiction and the possibilities of the sentence. And so I guess I'm interested in a way, like how much you can strip away and still have meaning, and when you strip many things away, but some things are remaining, then they can sort of talk to each other in the way that they wouldn't be able to if there was more sort of cluttering, cluttering the scene or cluttering the passage or cluttering the sentence. And so it's like I want to strip things away, but then I still want these sort of mysteries to exist, almost in a plain way. When I talk in the book about hiding something in a sentence, it's like suggesting something, even saying it, but not having it be true and acknowledging that it's not true, but making it still exist.
I found my note that I loved from the book too. You mentioned that it's this idea of like haunting a sentence. So what I wrote down was conjuring something that isn't there so it both is and isn't appearing, which is really cool. I think it's also the power of your sentences. I mean, they're so eloquent, but also very precise. And I wanted to ask you about aesthetics as well in novels, what that means for you in terms of like how the final novel reads as the form, or this book as well, how it actually tangibly appears on the page, like what that means for you as a writer and a reader.
Well, it means a lot. I mean, I think about aesthetic experience a lot, just as a person. I think of it when I'm looking at artwork or, when I'm just taking a walk, and I think about it in the books that I read, and I think about it when I'm writing, not just for myself, not just creating this aesthetic experience for me to kind of explore, but also creating an aesthetic experience for the reader. I end up thinking about these things a lot more than something like plot, which sometimes works out and sometimes becomes an obstacle, because an indelicacy, I did create a plot and then I had to deal with it. And that felt challenging.
This kind of goes back to my questions about how you explore mind spaces in this book, and thinking about one of my personal favorite books is Death in Her Hands by Otessa Moshfegh. I'm not sure if you've read it.
I have.
I love that book so much, and for a while, upon my first reading of it, I had so many questions about what was going on in it that it like required me to have a reread. I knew I loved it, but I couldn't really figure out why, and I reread it. And I think this idea of interiority in that book and her introduction of plot with this mystery that may or may not exist, but then really it being about Vesta exploring her mind space and how she considers herself at that point in the novel. When I talk about my love for that book, I always talk about the aesthetics of it. Like, I just love the idea of a novel about a woman in the woods with her dog finding a note. Like, that means so much to me as a reader. And then further in execution, like, it all kind of just comes together in a way that's hard for me to pin down in writing, I guess, of why it works that well, but it does. And so that frustration that I feel as a person that talks about books online and tries to, sell books to readers or sell why I love something, it can be difficult. But I think sometimes the joy of just aesthetics and reading can be its own form of joy, and that's okay. I don't know if you wanted to talk about anything that I just said, but
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something I think I've thought about this question a lot because I'm someone who can be sort of left speechless by something I love. I mean, completely speechless. I'm not always a good conversationalist about a movie right after I've seen it, for instance. I used to sort of feel that as a lack, and now I think I see it as a sort of transcendence, or, like I am interested in aesthetic experience that you are, that part of what's happening for you, and I think for me too when I read it with Death in Her Hands, is that you are having a kind of experience and it is aesthetic, and it's not that it's maybe limited to the aesthetic, but I feel like that's a book that kind of does lead you through an experience. And in a way, I'm okay with not always being able to say, maybe for many years, why something speaks to me so strongly, because often it is the things that I like the most. I talk about The Ravishing of Lulstein by Marguerite Duras so often that it feels repetitive, and yet I think it's taken me the 20 years since I first read it to really get to, and maybe I'm not even entirely there, but what it is in the book that I love so much, or that draws me to it. And it's like sometimes you return to those works, the ones that you feel so strongly toward, but that you can't maybe totally say. I mean, and maybe it cheapens it to be able to say in this like really articulate way.
I love that idea because, I mean, just in terms of like the expectation that I place on myself, kind of, I'm tying it, I guess, to like more tangible things in terms of like reviewing or criticism or thinking about books, and condensing your thoughts into some sort of form. But I love personally just sitting in this room and just reading and thinking about it with myself. And this idea of solitude in this book is really important. When I was reading it, I felt so seen because I was like, yeah, like I love like this idea also of traveling by yourself. Like next week, I'm going to New York by myself, and I'm very excited about doing it. But I also like traveling with my partner as well, and they're very different experiences. And I think you touch on those differences really well. My next question for you is about solitude, how you think about it for yourself, and how it affects your writing and reading.
Well, solitude is something that I've sort of been interested in. I don't know if I should say obsessed with, but interested in since I was a little girl. Like I think I recognized early on that a lot of my deepest experiences happen when I was alone. Not all of them. I mean, there have been deep experiences with people too, but and so it's a space that's always been important to me, since then, like now being an adult, that I've tried to protect. As I say in the book, even though I maybe have as a younger person, imagined myself alone so much, when I daydreamed about my future. I do like to have people in my life, like just as much. But that said, I think that solitude is necessary, for us to do the work that we do. And, not only that, just to be full people, to be who we are when we're not attached to others, in our lives.
Just on this note of like intimacy and being on your own in solitude, the book I loved. It was kind of funny as well how you talk about lighting in the book and your sort of criticism of people's how people think about lighting generally. And so I wanted to ask you about how you think about lighting and like your preferred reading setup.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I like natural light, so I'm in natural light right now, in the daytime, but I like soft lighting. I like warm lighting. I mean, I need warmth. Yeah, like a harsh overhead light is just terrible to me. Like I almost can't relax in it. I can't enjoy myself. I mean, I think in life I kind of almost need like a certain atmosphere just to yeah, just to enjoy things. And that gets kind of transferred into like I have to have, an atmosphere, not just, like physically around me in order to write, but like within what I'm writing. Like I also need it to sort of have, pleasurable qualities or qualities that are interesting to me. But yeah, it's, when I first moved in with my husband, I realized like, yeah, he'll just come in and just turn on like some kind of like blaring overhead light, and I'll walk in and it'll just like drive me crazy. I have to instantly soften it.
No, I totally agree with you on that.
Yeah.
And my partner's very specific about lighting too. So when I saw that, I was like, yes, I totally get that.
Yeah.
But I also think, tying it to like reading and thinking about like my preferred reading setup and how I like, I don't know, take in books, I feel like time and place are also important to consuming novels. And I wanted to ask you about that and sort of shifting perspectives of novels over time and how memory plays for you in terms of how you think about novels years down the line. If you say if you haven't reread them or if you do, I'm trying to think of what that means because the novel still exists or a book exists as this final form and it can sit on your shelf and it doesn't change. But then in your mind, the way you perceive it or the way that you think about it, it can completely change like the plot of the novel. You could think the ending is different in the future or how you feel about characters. Like I just want to know your thoughts on that because it's been really interesting for me thinking about like reader perception over time and what that means for novels as a form.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting rereading something because so much can be different, or just new things can kind of present themselves to you, maybe because it's a rereading, but also because you've changed, or you've gotten closer to something in your own thinking, and then when you meet it, in the book, I don't know, you're ready for it in a different way. But it's it can take me a long time to reread a book, even when it's one of my favorites. I mean, somehow, just to go back to The Ravishing of Lil Stein, like I read that book and then I think it took me 20 years to read it again. I don't know why. It was so important for me. But I think there's this way I have sometimes of thinking like I've already read that book. There's so many other books I want to read. And it's true, like that's part of it. It's just like my to read, pile is so big. Like it's just there's always this long queue. And so I think it can be hard to think like, okay, I'm going to go back to something. And yet it's pretty important, like and it can I'm often surprised at how pleasurable it is to read something again. Because I think often I've thought, well, like I've read this, it can't be as pleasurable as it was when I first discovered it, when I first encountered it. But often it is, or it gets close.
So going to another question that I've been asking in many of these author interviews, and it's I don't know why I've been so tied up with this question, but I find that when I'm looking online at book reviews or people online that I follow that talk about books, I often see the idea of realism being a certain metric for whether a work of fiction is successful, whether it's ringing true to some sort of reality or if it could be possible. And I wanted to get your ideas on realism in fiction and what that means for you and if it's a certain metric for you at all or if not.
It's definitely not a metric for me. And though I can enjoy reading something that is realist, for sure, I never think about it at all when I'm writing. I think that I often don't write real things. I mean, that sounds weird. I write real things. But, again, just thinking back to Indelicacy, you brought up the fact that it's in this kind of unspecified time and place that combines, or different times and places at once. And so I think I'm just so preoccupied with other things, other aspects of what writing can be, like setting and like narrative voice and like atmosphere and imagery and objects, that it's like there's no space for me to think about realism. And it doesn't have, probably, like I said, a lot to do with what I'm writing. So I can appreciate it as a reader, but it's also like that's not the only kind of novel I like to read. I like to read absurdity. I like to read strangeness, so not that reality can't be strange or absurd, but sometimes I like to read things that push those things maybe further than they would exist in a real way.
In terms of realist novels, I think it's very important, and I think I've enjoyed many myself. But I agree with you. I mean, I think that's what's one of the joys I think of fiction is being able to play with any of those aspects as well. I just realized you're the first author that I've had on that talking about like a work of nonfiction, which is really fun. But aside from that, extended from the question of realism is the exploration of perfection in this book. And one example that you give is your critique that you find of The Days of Abandonment by Elena Ferrante. So could you talk about perfection and how you think about it generally?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in that section of the book, I'm kind of sort of critiquing the idea of needing things to be perfect or wanting them to be perfect, and looking at what can be good about books that aren't perfect. But at the same time, I've heard myself say many times, like, this book is perfect, like, or, like, oh, this is perfection, So it's like, in a way, I just wanted to look at that more closely. Like, if I don't actually believe that a book needs to be perfect, then why am I describing it as perfect? And I think what I've gotten to is just that maybe perfection in that case means that something is just truly itself, like it's found its right form, whatever that is. Flaws, I feel like flaws sometimes, in a piece of writing, sometimes show the writer's reach, or maybe if there's a flaw in something I've written, it shows what I'm trying to get to, or, like what I feel in conversation with, even if I couldn't completely get there, or if the other writer couldn't get there, it's still, I don't know, it's something exciting still can come from it. I'm sort of less forgiving of flaws when I feel like they're a product of trying, clinging to the idea of trying to tell a certain kind of story, or of clinging to plot, above all else. So that, in that section of the book too, I talk about the fictional dream, that John Gardner, I think he's the one who coined that phrase, in his book, The Art of Fiction, and how the dream is made up of things like details. It's not about the plot. And so I feel like if, like, a writer's in their sort of like pursuit to sort of tell a certain kind of story, or work with plot in a certain kind of way, if they destroy that dream, then it's a flaw that I don't find as interesting.
It was this last weekend. I posted about Sula by Toni Morrison, and I said perfect novel alert. And when I was flipping back through this, I saw the section on perfection. I'm like, why did I say that it's perfect? Like, what does that mean? So it was interesting to hear you say that. I loved that book. I can say that.
Yeah, yeah. I
But
was going to ask you, for you, when you use that word to describe it, like, what do you know why you
yeah,
described it as perfect?
I feel like it's simply the fact that I feel like everything is in its place and it sustained me the entire time. And I think also something to do with like endings is important for me when I think about perfect novels, because like once you close it, you instantly have that feeling, okay, that was perfect, at least for me. And so maybe that's something to do with it. I mean, how do you feel about endings in fiction generally? I think you said for Indelicacy you had a tough time with the ending of that book. If
Yeah,
I'm
I did. Yeah. I mean, it felt very different from, before Indelicacy, I had written two collections of short stories. And in a way, I would just sort of, in a particular short story, let myself stop, not sort of randomly, not in this way, like, oh, I'm just going to stop now. But I would just have this feeling like, okay, it's time to stop. And I knew the story was done because I had cleared enough of the clutter away. And, the things that were left were talking to each other, and they felt complete in themselves. Yeah, with Indelicacy, maybe because it was a novel, or is a novel, and it was the first novel I had ever written. it just felt trickier. And I did sort of write, a plot that I then had to deal with, and so, and I think also what was challenging for me is that I knew early on what the final page of the book was going to look like, but I didn't know entirely what was going to get me there. And so it meant that I was sort of writing towards that ending the entire time. And I told myself I would never do that again. Like if an ending appears to me, like I just sort of, and with the novel I'm working on now, a sort of simple ending has appeared to me, but and I'm holding it near, but I'm not telling myself like this is the ending because I don't want to get into that same situation.
That's so interesting to think about how a writer knows when they're done, because that's something to I think about this a lot with the short form as you're mentioning. I love short stories so much, and I've been thinking a lot too about the differences between the short form versus a novel and what interesting distinctions there are there. So I guess for you, when you're writing and reading, I guess both questions apply. How do you consider short stories versus novels generally? It's a very broad question, so I don't know if you have anything specific that you think about the differences between those two.
It's interesting because, it's all fiction, and so they obviously share a lot in common, but for me, in a way, they remained sort of separate. So, when I wrote I Go to Some Hollow and I wrote Creature, and I thought I may never write a novel, and I was sort of pushed by, teachers I had and various people to write one because, what I was told, and I think what many people are told is like it's harder to publish a short story collection. You can't make any money on them, not that I've ever been writing to make money, but and I just didn't care because I thought, well, it doesn't matter. I'm a short story writer, and this is what I naturally seem to want to be doing. But I found when I was writing Creature that I was sort of starting to move towards a more singular voice, in some of the stories. And so I felt naturally that I did want to try to write a novel, and like I wanted to challenge myself as a writer, but also I just felt like a natural pull in that direction. And now that, after writing Indelicacy, I sort of felt like I don't know if I can write short stories right now. Like not, just in this way that like there's no pull, but also it sounds hard, like I've often heard novelists say like short story writing is hard, and short story writers say like novel writing is hard, and I think they're both hard, and I think for me that when I'm in the space of one I can't actually get into the other one. I don't know if that will remain true. It could be like after I finish this novel I'm writing now, I may feel pulled back towards short stories, but they both feel difficult to me in different ways. And I'm someone who I take a long time to find the space of a piece, whether it's a novel or a short story. Indelicacy took a year. Any short story I write takes like a month to even find the voice, find the atmosphere, find the space, the set, all of that stuff. And so it started to feel like a lot of work, because I'm also a slow writer, even when am like sitting down writing. And it started to feel like it's taking so much out of me to like create, a new world for each story. I don't know that it's that way, for every fiction writer, but I sort of was like, yeah, I just want to create it and then stay within it. Like I don't want to keep starting over.
I love hearing you talk about that because I don't know, short stories and novels, they feel so different in my mind, but you mentioned at the start of your answer that like they're both fiction, and it has me thinking about generally the distinctions between all of these different forms that we, talk about. And like this is just a question that I just came up with right now. So bear with me, but I mean in terms of this book, like could one call this a novel, do you think?
Um, it's possible. What's been interesting to me is to hear from people that they feel like some of the same things are important in this book as are important in my fiction. So something like atmosphere and something like narrative voice. That's been surprising, because I think in my mind in a way, like I've seen fiction and nonfiction as so different from each other. But I'm realizing that probably the space I enter for each of them actually is pretty connected. So I don't know. I don't think I personally would call it fiction, and yet I think it probably shares some qualities with fiction and with the fiction that I've written. And fiction to me, and I don't know that everyone sees it this way, it feels to me full of possibility. Like I have complete freedom in it. I can do whatever I want. Where I think part of the challenge of writing this book for me was that I felt, and this might be like I was putting my own sort of borders that, but I felt less freedom in writing nonfiction somehow, and of course that I couldn't do whatever I wanted. And of course, that's not true. Like you can at any time, and you don't have to think about whether something is fiction or nonfiction. You can just write, and it can share, both things, can sort of describe what it is. But I did sort of feel I started getting a little tired of like I don't know, like essay form in the book, and found myself needing, so there are some sections in the book that sort of go maybe into a bit of a different space than some of the other sections that might feel like more traditionally like an essay. And I think as a writer, I had to do that. I had to sort of, for myself, go into these other spaces, but also I just wanted to open up, I think, what the space of nonfiction was for me in this book.
Yeah, because I think something that shines through really well in this, and that it doesn't feel completely essayistic, is that it's very interior and self-reflective, which is kind of why at times it reminded me of Indelicacy in terms of atmosphere and how it's told, just, but also it had me thinking of just like autofiction generally, and the idea of like an interior narrator in a novel, how it kind of feels similar to this and just a person thinking on the page. In terms of autofiction, do you enjoy reading autofiction?
I do read it. I read the authors who are sort of get categorized as autofiction, whether or not they sort of choose, to call what they're doing autofiction. So I think that that descriptor kind of gets cast on like Rachel Cusk and Kate Zambrino and, and others, Suzanne Scanlon. And so I do often enjoy the books that sort of go into that territory, regardless of whether they really are autofiction, or what that means, because I think it's such a big question too, like what autofiction is. And
Autofiction, I've been thinking a lot about it over the last like 2 years, and it kind of started for some reason. Autofiction and thinking about that sort of sparked my other, I don't know, more critical ideas about what fiction is. In doing that, I started watching a lot of author interviews, which I watched one like a night, which has been really
oh,
interesting. I just love hearing authors talk about their work. And I
yeah.
was thinking, I was like, why can't I do that too? That's what this ended up being, and I've been trying it. But I wanted to ask you about like perceptions of your work and just talking about your work on a public platform such as this. Like, how does that feel for you as well?
I like it. Partly because I find fiction itself, and writing itself, to be endlessly fascinating. It's part of why in Indelicacy, the my narrator is a writer, and I've written this nonfiction book that is about my life, but is about my reading and writing. Like I find them just sort of like endlessly fascinating. And so it feels generative to talk to people about it, like not just my own process, or what it looks like for me, but just like, what's possible in those forms, for others too. Or I feel like I get farther in my thinking about it, and Riding a Horse at Night really was partly about, just wanting to go further in my thinking about a lot of things, but writing especially, and fiction especially. So it's helpful for me, and I enjoy the conversations.
I'm glad to hear that, because I mean, I appreciate it so much, and this has been a really fun way of me to sort of get at these questions that I've had about fiction. So it's
Yeah.
also like my own sort of wanting to explore my ideas by talking with people that do it themselves. Aside from that, too, I wanted to talk about the title of this book, I Horse at Night, and there's a section here all about titles and what they mean to you. So can you discuss how you landed on that as a title?
Oh my gosh, titles are so, and yeah, I think I say this in the book, but they've become so hard for me. They've become almost one of the hardest parts of writing a book. And it's not hard for me to title an essay, an individual essay, or a story. Like I never found it to really be difficult to title short stories. But something about the entire book, I put so much pressure on myself. Sometimes titles will kind of appear to me early on, but you know, it never fails. Like I run them by my writer friends, and my non-writer friends. So many of the titles I choose get voted out, like I don't know. Like, one of the nice things about like going deeper into your own writing life is that you do learn to trust yourself, and like you trust, like I trust my decisions about like sentence writing, and I trust in like an atmosphere that I'm creating, but it's just like I don't have that when it comes to titles. It's almost like I'm not a writer anymore when it becomes time to when it becomes time to choose a title. And so I can honestly be with I can work on a book for years without knowing its title. And The Horse at Night went through many sort of bad titles and kind of landed on this one. And, some people liked it when I told them about it, and some people didn't. And it just stuck, and it kind of, it worked in terms of what I get to in the book about, I think, like freedom and, like just freedom in writing and living and things like that. But yeah, I don't know. Like titles, the novel I'm working on now, I've been working on it for 2 years. No title, I mean, it has a working title. Like, there have been a couple of working titles, but I don't know. Like I love mystery, but I don't love this sort of like wall that goes up where I can't get to I can't get to a title. Yeah. So it took forever to get to the title of Horse at Night.
One of the joys that I find in your writing, and I hope this isn't showing like in this interview too much, but I'm having a hard time like parsing through with like vocalizing what how I feel about your work and how important I find it to be. And I think what I love so much is how in your writing you are so candid and open about your experience of thinking through these things that I think that it makes me want to try writing myself because I
Mhm.
wonder if I would enjoy it. Instead of, trying to talk about something, what if I, spend time with just myself? I'm also an only child, so that's something I also think about. Grew up,
Yeah, me too.
yeah. So I wonder if writing would be something that would be beneficial to me, and talking to you has made me want to maybe try it and reading this
You
book as well.
should. Yeah.
Thanks. I'm gonna
Yeah.
have to see what happens. I'm very intimidated, and I find like writing reviews. I did that for a period. I find it to be quite frustrating, but I think I need to sort of shift my perspective in terms of kind of the analysis that I put on what I'm writing, like as I'm writing it. I think that's hard to remove myself from myself, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I
Um,
mean, you could write a book about, the reading experience. It's like I would love to read more books about people's reading lives, like that's not necessarily just literary criticism, like even if literary criticism comes into it, but that is, because I am one of the things I'm interested in most, as a reader and a writer is and a person is experience, and I find reading to be an experience that's worth like, in a territory that's worth looking at and writing about and thinking about.
I think I'm going to try to do that because this book is doing that. It is talking about the reading experience, and when I started reading it, I realized that that's what you were doing, and I was so excited about it. And I think the things that I'm excited by, I should make note of that, I guess, and
Oh
figure out
yeah.
why, and try to I don't know, indulge in it myself. But thank you for answering all these questions about this book. And before we wrap today, I wanted to ask you for a couple of just book recommendations if you have them, just kind of open floor, any recent reads you've read, any all-time favorites, and then anything upcoming that you're excited about.
I just read Our Lady of the Nile by Scholastique Mukasanga, which was amazing. It's a devastating novel. It's about, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's about an all-girls school before the genocide in Rwanda. Mukasanga lives, I think, in France now and is Rwandan. And yeah, it's just a devastating novel that somehow carries a lot of lightness in it too. And, Horse at Night, I talk about like being drawn to lightness, in works. And so it really kind of balances those two things. I also just read Catherine Scanlon's Kick the Latch, coming out with, well, it just came out with New Directions, and it's going to come out in the UK with Daunt Books. And Our Lady of the Nile, was it Archipelago? I'm forgetting which publisher it came out with, but with Daunt also in the UK. And so those are two books I would definitely recommend. They're
Kick the
amazing.
Latch has a horse on the cover, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
I just recently saw it somewhere.
Yeah, it has to do with a horse trainer, but it's amazing. And Catherine Scanlon is an amazing writer. She basically interviewed a horse trainer named Sonia, who's older now, I think, and based on those interviews, wrote this novel. And it's, if you haven't read Catherine Scanlon, she's just this kind of like master at precision and like whittling things down to like their sharp and beautiful essence. She's a writer I feel a lot in kinship with. But yeah, I'd recommend both of those books.
Awesome. Thank you. I'll leave both of those below in the description and the episode notes. And then also I'll leave a link to purchase A Horse at Night as well. I will be talking about this book incessantly on my channel this year and then going forward. It's a book that I will constantly return to. And so thank you for writing it. Thank you for coming on today. This means like the world to me, truly. And yeah, everyone, please read this book and talk to me about it. Thank you,
Thank
Amina.
you so much. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.